Well, that's certainly what we in the business like to call a bad movie. Yeah, I saw Harold and the Purple Crayon, and surprisingly, it was not very good. Honestly, I wasn't really expecting much from it. I know when the trailer first came out, it really got ripped apart by a lot of people, and critics have not been very pleased. And I can safely say it's pretty warranted. This might be one of the most generic, bland kids films I have ever seen in my life, which is a shame, because I loved the book as a kid. That was like one of my favorite books growing up. I remember reading it with my parents a lot, and so I was not really excited for this, but I was definitely curious, and yeah, the trailer made it seem like just a very generic, bland, uninteresting movie, and yeah, it's safe to say that's pretty much what I got. And unsurprisingly, it has not been doing very well in theaters. I'm pretty sure it opened with only like, what, $8-9 million? It made less money its opening weekend than Inside Out 2 did, which had already been out for 8 months. So yeah, not exactly a very good sign. It's probably a bad sign when one of the strongest aspects of a movie is the opening, because it pretty much opens with a recreation of the book, and it's very good. The art style is really pleasant, and you got this narrator, who's Alfred Molina for some reason. Yeah, that's kind of weird, but either way, he's basically retelling the book, but then obviously it continues on past that, where we see Harold has grown up now into an adult, played by Zachary Levi, and the narrator says, like, he lives in the real world, and Harold says, "Oh, I'd love to meet you someday," but the narrator says that's likely not possible, and then, of course, he disappears the next day, so Harold, along with his two companions, the moose and the porcupine from the original book, decide to go into the real world to find him. Yeah, that sure sounds familiar. Yeah, but of course, at first, Harold and Moose get separated from Porcupine, though she does end up joining them later, but either way, for the most part, it's just those two, and they run into this mother named Terry, as well as her son, who I can't remember the name of, but quite frankly, it doesn't matter. He is not very interesting, and of course, they decide to tag along, as any family film about fictional characters going into the real world would. Yeah, that's probably one of the biggest problems with this movie, is the story is insanely generic. If you've seen any fictional characters going into the real world movie, you have definitely seen this movie. It's basically the same as Enchanted, Barbie, Fat Albert, The Smurfs, any of those movies. It is basically that, and it adds nothing new to this type of formula whatsoever. It is some of the most generic stuff you've ever seen. Any type of scene you would expect to see in this movie is here. At first, one character warms up to the characters immediately, the other one is hesitant, but then slowly grows to care for them over the course of the film. They obviously get them into trouble, but they're like, "Oh, we're so sorry." Yeah, it's just so bland and so cliche. And the writing is also impressively not very good. I didn't expect this movie to be hilarious, but it is just so not funny. I mean, like I said, one of the main subplots or whatever is Porcupine is separated from Harold and Moose, so that she goes off on her own thing and literally at one point breaks into someone's house. She's like messing around with people in a restaurant, and I'm like, okay, this could be funny, but it's not. I don't know if it's the writing or the acting or whatever, but it just does not work at all. The quality of the acting varies wildly depending on the characters. Like, I feel like Zachary Levi as Harold is at least trying to make this kind of stuff work, but he very much is trying to be kind of like, I guess the best thing I can compare it to is like Will Ferrell in Elf, which I know is kind of a divisive performance. I feel like he's trying to be something like that, but again, it's not very funny. It just feels like kind of generic or whatever. The guy playing Moose, I don't know what the actor's name is, but he's clearly trying to be Kevin Hart. Like, the over-the-top reactions, the big crazy thing. I mean, literally, there's this semi-running gag about him for some reason, I forgot to mention this, Moose and Porcupine turn into people when they go into the real world, but Moose, whenever he gets scared, turns back into an actual moose. That happens, like, 4 times throughout the entire movie. Yeah, it's completely underutilized. He feels really generic, and the actress playing Porcupine, again, I feel like she's trying to make this material work as best she can, but it just doesn't. It's just not funny. And meanwhile, on the opposite end of the spectrum, Zooey Deschanel as Terry, the mother, she really feels like it's photoing, and she does not look like she wants to be there. This movie also has way too many plot lines going on. Like I said, they get separated at one point, but she gets chased down by the cops. We find out that the mother, unsurprisingly, her husband died, so she used to be like a pianist or whatever, but that barely comes into the story at all, aside from like 3 scenes. She works a job at a supermarket, which unsurprisingly Surprisingly, they show up, they wreck the store, she gets fired, and that's about it. The kid has this, like, imaginary friend that's a mishmash of a creature that his dad made up for him when they were young, and yeah, that doesn't really do that much. He gets bullied a couple of times in school, but literally we only see those kids in, like, 2 scenes. We don't even know their names, so, like, yeah, that's not important. They go to the library to try and find information where they meet this guy named Gary who is in love with Terry, and he's trying to write his own, like, fantasy book or whatever. Yeah, he's only in, like, 3 or 4 scenes in the movie, yet somehow ends up becoming the main villain at the end. Yeah, it just makes no friggin' sense. This movie does not really know what to focus on, and it doesn't really work. But I will say that this movie isn't horrible. There are some kinda interesting ideas. Like I said, Harold, of course, has the Purple Crayon, which he can use to draw whatever he wants, both in the book world, but also in the real world, and that's kinda cool. I think that's a really interesting idea, and they do some kinda interesting things with it. I will say, the effects on, like, the crayon itself vary wildly. Like, whenever he draws, like, an actual real object or whatever, it genuinely works. But when he draws, like, a fictional creature, like, at one point he gives the crayon to the kid and he draws, like, a spider fly, which looks really gross. The CG on that thing is just awful. It looks so bad. And there's a few other things like that in the movie. Yeah, they look bad. Really bad. And I'd say maybe every 20 minutes or so I got a bit of a laugh, like when they're looking for the old man, Harold, like, draws a plane and they try and write in the sky, but literally all they write is, "Old man, call me," and then they give Terry's phone number, so while she's at work she keeps getting phone calls from a bunch of old men. Like, that's pretty funny. There's also, during the climax, at first, aka mild spoilers, Gary gets his hands on the crayon, which he begins to try and use to, like, make his book come to life or whatever, but, you know, Harold snapped it in half earlier, so they each have a piece of the crayon that they can draw with, and when they first start out, it's styled like an old Western showdown from one of those old movies, and I'm like, okay, that's a little clever. So every once in a while, I feel like there's a decent laugh, or at least a small chuckle, but definitely not that much throughout the majority of the movie. And speaking of which, the climax feels completely pointless. Like I said, it starts out with them drawing a bunch of random stuff, and again, I feel like this is a really cool idea. You can literally draw anything. There's all kinds of stuff you can do, but either this movie didn't have a good enough script, or it didn't have the budget for some really interesting stuff, because all they do is draw, like, a lasso, an axe, a catapult, a giant spring, and then at one point Gary literally eats the crayon to, like, inherit its power, which, again, I guess could be kind of a cool idea, but they don't really do that much with it. And weirdly enough, okay, I'm gonna go into spoilers, but quite frankly, I don't think anyone is interested in seeing this movie. They literally give him what he wants. Harold gets the crayon back, like the full crayon, and he draws a door that allows Gary to go to the world of the book he was writing. So, in a way, he kind of gets what he wants, but at the very least, they destroy the door at the end. So, yeah, that's kind of funny. But overall, the climax of this movie is really uninteresting and really dragged out. Like, this movie is barely an hour and a half long, but it feels like it drags quite a bit. But at the very least, I will say, the ending is kind of nice. Again, spoilers, basically, they find the old man who was narrating in Harold's world was actually the original author of the book, so they go to, like, his old house, which has now been turned into a museum, and at first, Harold is upset to find out that he passed away, but then we actually get to see a lot of the original stuff about the original book, and even this letter that he supposedly read to him, and that's very sweet. I really enjoyed that moment. So, yeah, if there's one thing I can praise about the movie, it, at the very least, has a very good message about, like, you know, using your creativity and imagination and stuff, which I can see kids really appreciating. As a whole, I feel like kids might be able to watch this movie fine, but it's definitely not going to do anything for adults. It's not a horrible movie. It's harmless. Like, again, if you got little kids that want to go see it, I'd say give it a watch. It's harmless. Maybe they'll enjoy it fine, but as a whole, I don't think it works, and I don't think it's really going to stick around for much longer. I feel like this is one of those movies that's just going to come out, kids might watch for a little bit, and then it'll just fade into obscurity for 10, 20 years until someone finally remembers it actually happened. So, yeah, not a very good movie. I don't think it's really worth watching for most people. I give it a 3 out of 10.